Hi, this is Dave. I am afraid for the future of our country. And it's not just COVID and the reaction to it, and it's not just the recent riots and the looting and the all the turmoil. It's not just that. I think it's deeper than that. I'm afraid because I believe that the discipline of thinking before we act in every circumstance and every level of society is rapidly disappearing. In its place, we're witnessing a whole host of alternatives, and it seems to me it's like thousands of years of human development have been shrugged to the side, and a new ethic of rushing to conclusions with little objective basis has replaced it. We are regressing to the Middle Ages. And it permeates society at every level. The most visible non-thinkers are those who we would expect to be solidly committed to rational thought, and that is, the national politicians in Washington. The idea of calmly considering evidence from both sides of an issue and then making a thoughtful decision. Evidently, that idea has no currency in our sadly partisan environment. I would expect mature, educated men and women whom we have elected to represent us. I would expect them to bring the best thinking to their decision making. Instead, we see instance after instance of decisions being made in a mode that is the polar opposite of what they should be. Instead of rationally and calmly assessing the facts, they proceed with a predetermined conclusion based on an emotional agenda. The process of good governance has been knocked back hundreds of years. Actions based on emotional reasons devoid of any pretense of intellectual discipline have been the cause of countless instances of human suffering and injustice. Think of the millions of Hitler Youth, for example, where the emotional pressure to go along with the masses was strong enough to bury rational thought. Did one become a Ku Klux Klan member, for example, because of rational thought or because of an emotional payback? Look at the disaster in Venezuela as another example. Is there a rational defense of socialism somewhere in its background? Or did it derive from an emotional payback for power-hungry politicians? Where is the intellectual leader of the Antifa phenomenon? Or is it another instance of emotional payback supporting actions which cannot be defended rationally? The thousands of college students who demand, quote, safe places because they are not intellectually stout enough to withstand someone questioning their position, that has put the cause of higher education back hundreds of years. It's an example of confirmation bias on steroids. And probably the most influential offenders are the people who we used to call journalists, who have now become apologists and have en masse and wholeheartedly deserted the idea of objective news reporting and replaced it with selective, agenda-driven sound bites. It seems like everywhere we look, we see people who ought to be operating rationally and thoughtfully, instead being swept along in a wave of emotional motivation. It does not portend well for us individually or for us as a society. When we make decisions on the basis that it feels right, everybody else thinks that, or so it seems. When our rational mind is telling us to slow down and be wary, it almost always turns into a disaster. We end up taking the wrong job. We suffer months in the wrong environment. We find ourselves with the wrong people. We buy the wrong car. We live in the wrong place. Sooner or later, most of us realize the mistake we made, and we work to change it. The cost has been lots of time wasted, relationships damaged, and emotions exhausted. Learning to make decisions rationally and not be driven by emotional motivation is often part of the rite of passage to adulthood. You have not fully grown up until you've bridged that chasm. Unfortunately, too many people in our country have never made the transition and remain intellectually stunted well into their adult years. Bertrand Russell once said, quote, "Most people would rather die than think. In fact, they do." That's Bertrand Russell. As our society wanders further away from rational thought, the pressures from the media, the educational establishment, and the political area have made the transition from immature, emotionally driven decisions to mature, rational decision-making seem less desirable. The public arena offers fewer and fewer rational role models. When we lose the connection to rational thought, we regress as a society to a less civilized culture. Rational thought and the rule of law are bedrock principles that lift a society out of the arbitrary and capricious to a system that promotes justice and fairness to all. As a society, we don't have to look very deeply into history to see the disastrous consequences of the lack of rational thought. It opens the door to mob rule and almost always unjustly persecutes a few. Think of the Middle Ages or the infamous Salem witch trials. One of the dangers of emotionally driven behavior has to do with the potential turnaround of consequences. The Kavanaugh nomination was a great example. The media and political left promoted discarding the rule of law. Let's not pay any attention to hundreds of years of precedent because it didn't suit their pre-existing agenda. Every female accusation should be believed, regardless of the evidence they claim. The tables turned when Biden became the target of a similar charge. Once you abandon rational thought in favor of mob rule, you stand the very real possibility that it could turn on you. Anarchy is great until it's your business that is attacked and burned. Mob rule is energized until it's your family member that's injured or killed. Agenda-driven actions feel good until the situation turns on you and you become the victim. By then, it's too late. Actions taken in a wave of emotion almost always bring about unintended consequences and the guilt and regret that follow. As a civilization, we have lifted ourselves out of the Middle Ages, and it is incredibly sad to see us regress. Okay, that's it. We're done. Bye-bye.